All right, it's a busy day. It's moving fast in private. We're going to break down today's developments. We've got the CBC's Katie Simpson in Washington. And joining me in the studio is our chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton. Okay, Katie, let's start with you. Beyond the president, I guess, breaking news that Justin Trudeau is trying to cling to power. There's been a lot of things said in public. He's not, by the way. There have been a lot of things said in public in the United States about the tariff. So walk us through that. Bring us up to speed with what the U.S. administration has been saying.
Yeah, that post says a lot about this moment, but I'm going to let you talk about that. So, okay, here's what Canadians need to know about what is sort of officially coming out of Washington. The official thing is it is a chaotic, a dizzying day of mixed messages. The one thing the White House and officials seem to agree on is that, yes, they are going forward with an exemption, a 1-month temporary exemption of the 25% tariffs on automakers. They say it applies to all automakers that comply with USMCA or CUSMA, as we say in Canada. That, of course, is the renegotiated North American Free Trade Agreement. It is just for 1 month, and the White House gave a sort of a number of reasons to sort of get into that. But we'll get into that in a second. The other thing we heard from the White House today, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt suggested that other industries could possibly get carve-outs as well.
The president is open to hearing about additional exemptions. He always has open dialogue, and he'll always do, what's right, what he believes is right for the American people.
So that's the message coming from the podium at the White House from the press secretary who speaks on behalf of the president. And then just a couple of hours later, we heard from Vice President J.D. Vance, who was on that phone call between Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and U.S. President Donald Trump. He was asked about tariffs and exemptions and whether other industries have been coming forward to ask as well. And he gives a very different answer from what we just heard from the White House press secretary. Have a listen.
A number of industries have reached out to us to ask us for exceptions to the tariffs, but I think the president's been very clear here that he wants the tariffs to apply broadly. He doesn't want to have 500 different industries getting 500 different carve-outs, and the way to avoid application of the tariffs is to have your factory and have your facility in the United States of America. That is the way. Invest in America. That is how you will avoid being penalized by these tariffs.
So if you want to get an idea of what it might be like for Canadian officials to try to navigate all of this, you've got two very senior officials. You've got the vice president saying one thing. You've got the White House press secretary saying another thing. Both are extremely close to the president. So it's which is the actual answer. And the answer actually is it's going to be whatever the president says, because we all know the final decisions come down to Donald Trump. That is sort of the lesson that everyone is learning throughout this process. You can have all these different senior advisors saying all different kinds of things. At the end of the day, it's going to be whatever Donald Trump wants to do.
Right.
But he, again, in his speech last night to the American people, reaffirmed his commitment to tariffs. He thinks it's a way to help create jobs in the United States and build economic wealth.
Okay, Katie, I want to bring Rosie in a second about it. There was other mixed messages coming out of Washington today from Lutnick and others. Just walk us through what else happened there.
Yeah, and it comes down to the reasoning behind all of this. Canada has very firmly argued that this is not about the border, this is not about fentanyl, even though the Trump administration, the legal justification they're sort of pushing ahead with this on is about fentanyl. It's about stopping illegal immigration at the border, stopping the flow of illegal fentanyl from entering the United States. And again, Howard Lutnick, who's the Commerce Secretary who's dealing with the president on this, he presented this argument today to say, no, guys, this is about the border. Have a listen.
And then we need to see the Canadians and Mexicans put long-lasting protections in to protect America. Not this, I'm doing a lot of work for the last 3 weeks. Give me a break.
So there's that. But we're getting, again, mixed messages and additional reasons as to why the United States might be pursuing this. And that, of course, we heard a different argument. Caroline Leavitt, who is the White House press secretary, has spoken at length about fentanyl and how Donald Trump wants to stop it. But when she was asked about the exemption for the auto tariffs, she very clearly stated that the United States has some goals about boosting production in the United States. Have a listen to this.
He told them that they should get on it, start investing, start moving, shift production here to the United States of America, where they will pay no tariff. That's the ultimate goal.
So Canadians, if you are having trouble following along here and trying to connect the dots in all of this, it is confusing. It is mixed messaging. And what is, while we're having this conversation, we're sort of, just kind of making faces like this as we talk about it. The thing is, the consequences are so incredibly severe and so significant and important to the Canadian economy, jobs, workers, and the American workers, the American economy, and jobs too. So it is such a confusing moment, and we are just sort of at the start of whatever this is, and it is a trade war.
Yeah, I mean, Rosie, they have to keep saying, the U.S., I suppose, that fentanyl is the reason for this because that's the pretext of the emergency order, which could face a legal challenge, and if you say otherwise, officially you get into trouble. But you hear the mixed messages on carve-outs. Some information we've gotten this afternoon that they are talking about further exemptions. Dom LeBlanc and Howard Lutnick throughout the day looking at broadening the exemptions beyond the auto sector.
Yeah, I mean, listen, clearly there are serious conversations happening at levels below the Prime Minister and the President who spoke earlier today. And as we saw there, Donald Trump says it was a relatively friendly conversation. I think the carve-out for the automobile industry is important because we know that the automobile industry could have been shut down by the end of the week. So that is an important exemption. But is it enough for the Canadian government? The answer is no. They are continuing to have these conversations about other exemptions. And I should say the Canadian government's goal remains the same. Get rid of the tariffs altogether. So if there are other industries that, and you were the one who reported this, that are USMCA compliant or CUSMA compliant.
This is the standard the president wants. Apparently.
Whatever that means. I imagine it's probably not softwood lumber, for instance. It's probably not steel, but other things that fall under that definition, then those industries too could be exempt. And we should know that doesn't mean that Canada will pull back on its counter tariffs. It means that it will sort of respond in kind, in moderation, depending on how this unfolds. I think what Katie did there was very, very smart to present to Canadians, because this is what the government officials are grappling with.
Yeah.
An ever-changing demand from the president, the White House, and people around him, ever-changing explanations about what they are doing, and ever-changing signs of encouragement or not. And that is very challenging. Howard Lutnick and Dominic LeBlanc last spoke at 3 p.m. I think we expect them to speak again this evening. But everyone is being very, very cautious inside the Canadian government because they don't want to get their hopes up, given what Katie just laid out there so smartly.
Yeah, the conversation between the president and the prime minister is a little under now, about 50 minutes. LeBlanc and Lutnick texting and talking all afternoon. They have not yet spoken again, is what I am told. The president was being briefed on where things were at some point late this afternoon. So I wonder, Katie, what are you watching for down there, watching for next? Because it is the constituency of one, right? I know there is a sense amongst Canadian officials that a lot of the work they've done with cabinet officials, the sub-cabinet officials up until now, it seems pretty clear to them it wasn't getting to the president. They believe what is happening now in the direct conversations with Lutnick is getting to the president. What are you watching for next from down there with the incoherence and the uncertainty on messaging and reasoning?
It's got to be directly from Trump, whether it's on his Truth Social page or I don't think he has any other public events today, but we need to hear directly from Trump and not like Howard Lutnick, who is the Commerce Secretary. Every time he talks about what he thinks is going to happen, he very smartly couches it saying, it's up to the president. I think we could go in this direction. He might be leaning this way, but ultimately it's up to the president. He's trying not to get ahead of get out over his skis on any of these statements, but because ultimately it is the president who's going to make these final decisions. We also need paper. Let's get what's written down about the exemptions for the auto sector to make sure they actually are what they say they are. Is it amended executive order? Let's see it in writing what it actually is and when does it take effect, because it's one thing to say it out loud, but let's get some paper on this, because that's something that the Canadian government has had to really go through this entire process ever since these threats first started from Donald Trump back in November before he even took office again. It's let's get it on paper. What is the official ask? What is the official requirement? And so let's see about this exemption for the auto sector and get all of the details actually on paper. And then it's hearing directly from the president himself, because again, he is the decision maker.
It is encouraging, I will say, David, that the lines of communication are open.
Absolutely.
At very least. Like, there is some sort of dialogue happening between the two sides. And I think if we're going to take any kind of comfort, and I think we will right now, that is what we will take. Whether that gets to what Katie's talking about, a decision by the president that is different than where we are now, I think remains to be seen. The other challenge here, as well as the mixed messages around what is going on and what they actually want, is frankly the complete misrepresentation and false claims about what Canada is doing at the border. There is no doubt that progress has been made over the past month, and there are clear data points that they can look at to see that. And for the president to, frankly, say those things about Justin Trudeau staying in power, that is obviously an attempt to needle Canadians, to needle the Prime Minister at a time when that kind of response is not very welcome here. And it is particularly not welcome at a time when it is true that the Prime Minister is leaving and we are moving into a different political climate.
There is a part of the country, though, and a strain of the political environment here that will believe that, right?
Sure.
And that's the problem with the way social media is when it's not checked and regulated.
That's what I'm saying. When there's so many misrepresentations by the president about Canada and what is happening here, we have to be careful with that as well.
So, and just as a final point, Rosie, because we're going to take a break, but in terms of if there is a further exemption from the U.S., my understanding, I think your understanding is Canada will recalibrate its response, but they don't drop everything until Trump drops everything. That's where they are.
That's right. And that's what the provinces are saying too, right? Doug Ford isn't backing down just because something might be encouraging. They want to see this, they'll calibrate, as you said, but no one's walking away from tariffs unless the United States does the same.
It's remarkable. Howard Lutnick called Doug Ford yesterday and asked him to back off on some of his stuff, and Ford said no. All right, Katie and Rosie, we'll check in if there are further developments. Our Katie Simpson in Washington, our chief political correspondent Rosemary Barton here with me in Ottawa.
It is normal that we're worried. It is normal that we're anxious, but actually the strategy is working because it is through political pressure that we will be able to push back against this aggression.
There is both private and public push underway to get tariffs off Canada. Today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and President Donald Trump spoke by phone for about 50 minutes. It was their first call since the tariffs took effect. We know that conversations are ongoing and have been throughout the day, but in the meantime, the White House has announced a 30-day exemption for auto companies. According to Ontario Premier Doug Ford, that changes nothing.
That always concerns me when someone says, yeah, give us 30 days as we ramp up to start moving south of the border. That's unacceptable. I spoke to the Prime Minister earlier. We're on the same page, zero tariffs, and we are not going to budge.
Well, just like Doug Ford, other provincial leaders across the country are joining the tariff fight today.
Canada has a secret weapon in this trade conflict with the United States, a trump card, so to speak. And it is located directly under our feet. So until our U.S. friends come back to reality, we will focus on efforts and financial means to export one of the largest oil and gas deposits in the world elsewhere.
Effective immediately, what we are here to announce today is the Saskatchewan Liquor and Gaming Authority will stop purchasing U.S.-produced alcohol. And we'll stop selling any U.S. alcohol that we currently have in stock to any of the private retailers that are in the province.
Okay, we're going to pick up the conversation there with the Power Panel. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communications strategist and co-host of the Beyond a Ballot podcast. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. And here with me in the studio, Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist, and Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of the Hill Times. Amanda, where we are right now, as I understand it, is that Howard Lutnick and Dominic LeBlanc have been talking and texting all day. The Commerce Secretary was going to brief the President at a certain point and then get back in touch with the Finance Minister, and then we'll see where we are. They are discussing a further exemption for sectors that meet the President's standard of compliant with USMCA, whatever that means. But the hope is to get more relief from the economic pain of these tariffs. What do you make of where we are right now?
Well, before we got on the panel, I was reading a quote from Flavio Volpe, who's the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturing Association, he said, round and round we go, where we stop, nobody knows. And I think that's the most accurate portrayal of the merry-go-round that we're on. It is utter and complete chaos. The markets are in chaos. Jobs look like are in chaos. How businesses can respond, the viability of those businesses, chaos. And it's the unpredictability and uncertainty that is causing this chaos. So a 30-day reprieve, well, we had a 30-day reprieve from the 25% tariffs, and 30 days later, they're intact. And one day later, we're into another scenario. And so that kind of uncertainty does very little to help the markets. And it does very little for any businesses or frankly, for any families who are trying to budget and trying to understand what the ramifications and the consequences of this are. So I don't think we're any further along. Yes, we have this reprieve and it's a 30-day reprieve. And I think what you would hear from, from the provinces and from the feds is that there is this pressure underway, and that in this example, the pressure is working, that you have the big three, the big auto manufacturers that were able to convince Trump that they needed this reprieve. But what happens at the end of 30 days? They basically made the promise, yes, we'll continue to invest in the U.S. auto market, but we also need certainty around both the tariffs and the environment that they're operating in.
Yeah, Melanie Joly said earlier today, we can't go through this psychodrama, in her words, every 30 days. James, we have Caroline Leavitt at the White House podium saying the president is open to exemptions. J.D. Vance saying at a press conference he doesn't think they're open to exemptions, while Howard Lutnick negotiates with Dominic LeBlanc about further exemptions. That's a window into what Canada is dealing with here.
Yeah, and meanwhile in Canada, we have a prime minister with 4 days left on the clock, and then an incoming prime minister with maybe 4 or 5 days on the clock, and then we have a month and a half of an election campaign, and so our coherence on our side of the border is not so awesome either. I do have to say, though, that across the country, the premiers have genuinely stepped up, from David Eby to especially Premier Ford, Danielle Smith, Scott Moe, Tim Houston, everybody. It reminds me sort of the Canadian consensus that existed after 9/11. It reminds me of the consensus that existed in the first sort of 6 months of the COVID crisis, where everybody was marching hand in hand, where there was clear consensus about what the problem was, what we needed to do about it, and what the Commonwealth interest was across the country. And so I'm sort of very proud of my country today, that we all understand what the problem is. It's Donald Trump and his predatory approach to treating friends as enemies and treating enemies as friends. And this is a long-term problem. And I think J.D. Vance, if I have to sort of pick amongst the examples of communication today that you just strewn out there, I think J.D. Vance is the one that we should really keep an eye on, right? Where he said the only way to avoid these tariffs, is to repatriate your jobs and your plant and your infrastructure into the United States, which, again, as a talking point sounds good, but they have a 4-year burn, and J.D. Vance wants to be president after Donald Trump. This is a long-term game of America trying to build a castle, isolated America from the rest of the world, where they will turn their backs on the agreements that they sign. They will turn their backs on their military and security commitments that they sign. And I think this is a very problematic, dark world that we're in right now. But I'm proud of the premiers and the Canadian consensus that exists, because this is going to be a long-term tactical need for Canada to look out for our interests and recognize America for what it is now turned into under Donald Trump.
Look, when they talk, Jordan, when they talk about the repatriation of manufacturing, they're saying the quiet part loud, right? I mean, they have to talk about fentanyl because it's the pretext for the executive order, and it's the emergency that they're talking about here. But I think as more and more time passes, certainly from the Oval Office exchange last week to the speech last night to the trade war we're in now, the true nature and intention of this administration is being laid bare.
That's right. This has nothing to do with fentanyl, and I think that we have now dispensed even with that pretense. And what James is saying is exactly correct. This is about a long-term attempt to restructure the North American economy only and uniquely to the favor of the United States. And frankly, Vance and Trump don't care how many workers and families on either side of the border they hurt along the way. And I think that what we're seeing today with this new discussion, with Lutnick out talking about exemptions and auto exemptions, like this, it's extortion, right? The idea here is to make this big statement with these tariffs that are completely unjustified, to launch this trade war, and then say, well, we're gonna start to create some carve-outs, and so this notion of meeting somewhere in the middle is complete garbage. There is no meeting in the middle on an unjustified attack. And I think that actually Premier Ford and the Prime Minister are quite right to say that what we're seeing in terms of these exemptions is actually very concerning, because the idea of giving a month reprieve, well, that is just to do exactly what J.D. Vance was talking about. That month is there so that Trump and his administration can pressure those auto manufacturers to relocate to the United States. So this is not a reprieve. This is, in fact, exactly the opposite. And chaos and destabilization is a big part of the point. And I think that what we're, and like, it's really important to underline, like, people have already lost their jobs because of this. We've seen layoffs in Quebec. We've seen layoffs at Algoma Steel. So families in Canada are already being impacted by this.
Yeah, look, I don't think you can relocate a car plant in a month, right? But it sends a signal about, what you need to do in the 46 and a half months remaining in this presidency, right? And the transactional nature of everything, Sherelle, it's get your manufacturing inside our borders. It's give us your minerals, Ukraine, and all of the resource revenue from that. This is the nature of this presidency, and this is the challenge in dealing with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of what, means many people have been saying, for months at this point, is that Donald Trump wants a win. He does whatever he can to look like the winner in any given situation. So if he's getting the sense from, big business, and they're saying, hey, we'll back you on this if you give us something, and that might be this reprieve, he's going to go for that, simply because even though it might look like he's backing down a little, he still is able to tell, the American people, well, I'm getting this because they're going to bring these jobs home. So whatever the win is, whatever tickles his fancy, that's what Donald Trump is going to go after. And so, yes, they're saying the quiet part out loud, but I don't think it was ever that quiet. Yes, the written executive order talked about fentanyl, it talked about the borders. But, look at what Donald Trump said just today, where he, in his version of the readout of the call with Prime Minister Trudeau, where he said, well, Trudeau told me that, we had, the numbers have gone down on fentanyl, and I basically didn't believe him. It's like, you can't argue with somebody who refuses to deal in basic facts because he wants to believe his own version of the truth.
There is a belief, though, in the administration here that there pushes with Tom Homan saying, this is what we're done, this is what we're doing, and other members of it's not getting to Trump. They think now Lutnick is definitely bringing the information to him, but it is unclear, I think, to people at the top of the Canadian government whether, while cabinet ministers in the U.S. cabinet have been hearing them, it may not be making its way to the president. This is one of the challenges they're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been hearing it from Lutnick today, is saying he is going to bring it to the president. He's going to brief him. So he's having all of these conversations, and he's saying, okay, yeah, this might be good. There might be a chance for that. But we'll have to see what the president says. You heard the press secretary today at the podium basically saying, well, the president gets to decide. And when people pushed back against the numbers, she's like, well, you don't get to choose. The president gets to choose. So it all comes back to him.
I know. But, when I talk about, Amanda, the quiet part loud, there was always a suspicion about their lack of support for Ukraine, and then what happened in the Oval Office happened in the Oval Office, and now aid and intelligence sharing are all on pause, as an attempt to sort of pressure Zelensky to apologize and come back and do things. I just, if the information hasn't gotten to him, and even if it does, it isn't believed, and the people around him are, I don't know if anyone's speaking truth to power in there. How do you get around this as a federal government, whether it's Justin Trudeau, whoever replaces Justin Trudeau, and then the winner of the next election, if this is sort of the reality and nature of this administration?
Well, I think you have to continue to pull on every lever that you have to access that administration. And that's all you can do. And unless he's living under a rock, which I don't know where he's living, he certainly must have heard where Canada's at vis-a-vis the border plan and the fentanyl discussion, but it's not about fentanyl. So that doesn't help his narrative. And if it doesn't help his narrative, why would he agree to believe it? I mean, his version of the truth is the only thing that matters to him. But you saw, they lay it out. They're pretty transparent when it comes to what they want. When the press secretary took to the podium today, she said, you have this month reprieve and you know what to do. You can use the month to work toward the president's goal. She actually said, get on it, start investing, start moving, shift production. She's very clear. That's the ultimate goal, is to get those manufacturers to continue to invest in the US. And while you can't do that in a month's time, he is demanding action as quickly quickly as possible, because he's gone to the polls and he's said to his voters, the reason why you voted me in was on these affordability issues. And while Americans watch as prices tick up and the stock market crashes and things get more expensive, he needs some wins. He needs to show that this, quote unquote, golden age is really in the horizon.
James, you were saying earlier you're proud of the Canadian consensus and how the premiers are responding. And there has been like a pretty strong unified show of strength. But we did hear, and I'm not saying this to pick on Daniel Smith and Scott Moe, but they have said even today, with the tariffs in place, they don't support anything that sort of puts an export tax on energy or restricts the flow, or similarly with potash. And these are areas where you can really put some acute pain on the United States. I wonder if what your thoughts are, how that affects Canada's negotiating position, because I can understand the impulse of the premiers of those provinces to want to protect their core sustaining industries. But, when the whole country is being hit this way, what do you make of that distinction being laid on the table?
Well, my preference is a maximalist approach for a whole bunch of reasons. We have to sort of think of this as, we're smaller than the United States, but we're a rattlesnake in a fight. And when we fight and we sting, and it hurts. And, there are things that we can do, whether it's potash, uranium, steel and aluminum, energy, things that we can do. We should do that. However, Daniel Smith is operating in a political environment that's a little more challenging, frankly, than the rest of the country. Doug Ford, by the way, he's the first person to be elected of a significant office, but he's the first person to be elected anywhere in the Western world explicitly on a platform to stand up to Donald Trump. That's why Doug Ford was reelected. Let's not be happy doubt about it. So he can be more strident and more aggressive about this than others can. Danielle Smith as well. She has a political environment in which she's operating where, a lot of people in Alberta, still have some sympathy towards Donald Trump for some of the things that he is doing, whether it's crime, immigration, culture war politics and all of that. Now, that number of Canadians who have a little bit of a sympathetic view of Donald Trump is shrinking dramatically as the hours tick by. But they still do exist, and they exist, I'm sure, in Danielle Smith's caucus and party and her voting base. And so she has to be a little bit careful about that. But everything that she said today signals that she understands the fight that's in front of us. She's a Canadian first, and she understands the obligations that are in front of her.
No, she called it a betrayal, right? Which she was criticized for going to Mar-a-Lago. She made very clear how she feels about it today. But James, if you support the maximalist approach, the Prime Minister, and we heard the Foreign Minister today saying they don't want to do anything that fractures national unity, they don't want to do anything over objections of premiers, and they don't want anyone to be hurt disproportionately. But can you be prepared to go ahead with an export tax on energy or potash or something, or uranium or whatever, over the objections of a premier if that's what it takes? I mean, how do you calibrate that in the First Minister's level?
Well, I think this does require a bit of statecraft within the country, which is, Albertans on a per capita basis have given more to Confederation than any group of Canadians in this country by far. And they've done it for a couple, 2, 3 generations. And they have a federal government right now whose time is ticking that has actively campaigned against their province, against their core industry that is 1/3 of Canada's exports to the United States. They've blocked pipelines. They've put in place regulations that are designed to be poison pills to stop the export of Alberta oil to global markets so they can get world prices, so that we can bring that money back to Canada and create Canadian jobs and pay Canadian taxes to build Canadian hospitals, schools, and Canadian roads. Albertans want to do their part for Canada, and they have for a long time. So I think Danielle Smith and Albertans are prepared to do everything, including a maximalist approach, but a little bit of quid pro quo. They'll do their part. Canada should do its part for Alberta and the West as well. Open ports of access to the world so they can sell their products to the rest of the world. Fair's fair, and Alberta just wants a fair deal, and I think that's appropriate.
So, Jordan, how do you think the Prime Minister and whoever's the Prime Minister next week and then the weeks after that, approaches something like this, given these very clear lines and challenges?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is statecraft. Like that's what's going to have to happen. And look, I mean, to James's point, it's very clear that Danielle Smith is not actually willing to put everything on the table. That's why she is resisting the idea of an export tax. So I think that while we have seen, and to her credit, a turn in her rhetoric and an acknowledgement that normalizing what was happening with Trump was probably not the right way to go, she's still not putting all the tools on the table for Canada's response. And I think that that's something that any Prime Minister is going to need to work with her and with Scott Moe on to make sure that we bring everybody on board. I think the biggest danger here that we could see in Canada is a regional fracturing, particularly as the pressure increases if tariffs go on for a long period. Ontario in a lot of ways is going to be the first one to bear the brunt, particularly as the auto sector impacts roll out. But we are going to see it across the country. And we have to be very careful to make sure that there's burden sharing in terms of what happens and the damages. But, you know, to the question of whether or not pipelines are an immediate solution to this, look, you know, and James knows this very well. He was part of a government who was not successful in getting those pipelines built either. This is not a quick solution to that problem. And so we have to look realistically at what's on the table in front of us right now. And that includes tools like export taxes on energy, and that includes energy in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and that's got to be part of a national conversation.
Well, and Cheryl, there's the reverse sort of challenge, right? Bloomberg is reporting that Donald Trump is considering exempting certain agricultural products from this because, you know, I guess that keeps food cheaper in the U.S. You pulled Team Canada together to have a united response, but then, oh, Ontario, your auto sector's out. Oh, Saskatchewan, you know, or your agricultural sector's out. Oh, maybe the fishery will be out. You start picking people off in terms of a united front, and it becomes a divide and conquer kind of approach.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it, the divide and conquer element. And that's why I thought it was so striking that Doug Ford today was very strident about saying, okay, yes, you're coming at us with this 30-day reprieve, but that doesn't change how I feel about this and what the response is going to be. Ontario is not going to change anything, because really what they are fighting against is the threat to cut off energy to those states that Ontario supplies with electricity. That was the sticking point, and that's where really that reprieve is coming from. I mean, yes, it's the businesses and the automakers, you know, having the president and the administration's ear, but it is also very much this threat of electricity, and that seemed to get some sort of result. If everybody wanted to kind of play that card and say, okay, well, we're going to push back this hard with these various industries, no matter what is actually going to be coming down the pipeline in terms of reprieves or carve-outs or what have you, then I think we might see something more drastic in terms of tariffs getting lifted. It is, you do see that there is, Donald Trump has the ear, or businesses have his ear. So whether it is, you know, bourbon makers, whether it is the automakers, these are the people who are managing. If it's not his cabinet, these are the people who are managing to get through to him and say, hey, let's rethink this a little.